Continuing with Muckle 8, Part 6, we were talking about structural violence versus cultural difference. So structural violence basically says that because you are a woman or female or young, that you're just going to have a greater chance of being exposed to violence than someone else who is not fit your categories. So, for example, I've never been beaten up. I've never been had someone punch me in the face really hard, um, and this is not exceptional for other people like me who are very large males. But when I was a kid, I could have been beaten up, but I wasn't. Because I grew up in a sort of a sheltered environment due to my race, due to my class, due to my family's reputation in the community, or whatever. But other people have been beaten up a lot more, um, and this is due to the categories that they fit into, due to the kinds of schools that they've gone to, or the neighborhoods that they live in, or characteristics about them um, that have resulted in the greater chance of them facing violence. And many of you probably know what I'm talking about. Many of you who have faced this violence. Think about what it would have been like if you didn't fit into those categories. So we have to realize that these are entirely valid cultural categories to fit into. They fit into cultural difference. They make sense. It makes sense to have rich people and poor people. It makes sense to have people who are beaten down by society, whereas people who are protected by social, protected by police or whatever. Whereas people who are beaten by police. But just because these things happen doesn't mean that it's justified. Just because it's misogyny does exist in our society, um, and women are at threat of rape to greater extent than men are. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing, right? So we can say that even though it's a cultural value of ours, it's not a good one, or of any other cultures. So we should never conflate structural violence with cultural difference. Things can be culturally appropriate and still wrong, um, even though they're culturally appropriate. There we go. So they can be maladaptive. A culturally relative perspective toward maladaptive cultural behavior. Uh, it doesn't mean that we don't criticize valid cultural practices that also happen to hurt people. Um, However, it does mean that we focus on trying to find culturally relevant methods of reducing those behaviors. So if you see something going on, if you work in West Africa, for example, where there is female genital mutilation, FGM, clitoridectomy, or something like that, um, you can criticize it. You can say, yeah, this is not a good thing that you're doing. Try to find ways to stop. But if you march in there as an outsider coming in and telling me that my culture is bad and that I have to change it, that's not going to affect my behavior. I'm still in charge in my culture. And so you who want to influence me have to come up with better ways, more appropriate, more thoughtful, more culturally relative ways, more effective ways of getting me to change instead of just marching in there and telling me it's wrong. Okay? Function of culture. Most cultural features function in some way. Discovering the internal quote unquote cultural logic of a certain feature is what anthropologists do. One example of that is when we raise children. We do dependence training. Um, if we live in cultures that support the family over the individual, um, if individual identity is deeply and strongly tied to the family group's well being, then individuals are going to see the family as really, really important and are going to reproduce those values with their child rearing practices. Independence training, in contrast, takes place where you have individual self reliance of the child, even over the family's well being. We want to see you succeed even if the family goes down, you kid. As a result, you're going to see independence training building up that individuality. So my example of that is when I was in Egypt with the two little kids. Um, One of them was almost 3 when we went there, but the other one was born there, and so he's learning how to walk. So he's a little toddler, toddling around, and then falls down whump on his rear end and looks up at me. And of course, being a Midwestern American, um, I say, you're good, get back up, keep going. And immediately all the Egyptians around watching are just horrified. They're like, what kind of monster is this? Because that's the last thing you want to teach an Egyptian kid, is that everything's okay and you're good. All the working class Egyptians who are ubiquitous in the wealthy suburb of Cairo where I was living, nannies and gardeners and security guards and others would just freak out. They're like, how on earth can you do that? You have to, go over to him and dust him off and say, oh, you're okay, don't cry, and make a big deal out of it if he falls down and hurts himself. And I'm like, yeah, he's okay. He didn't really hurt himself. He can get up. He's fine. Because here in America, we try to encourage independence. Solve your own problems. Figure it out. Whereas in Egypt, they like to focus on dependence. Look for help. Ask for help. Look to your family. Your family will help you if you have any problems at all. Go to someone that you trust and ask them to help you. And that's the only way you can really survive. In America, the only way you can really survive is relying on your own resources. Don't ever ask for help. Do it on your own. Whereas in Egypt, it's like, don't ever try to go it on your own. Ask for help. We need each other, and you gotta look at it that way. So it's just the basic sort of the way child rearing functions to reproduce cultural values, and vice versa. The way cultural values work to reproduce certain kinds of child rearing. Fieldwork and methods and ethics. Anthropologists must do long-term fieldwork with a specific group, gathering data firsthand. Ethnography has two meanings. We have a book written about a culture, as well as the practice of researching and writing about culture. Both of these things are ethnography. We talk about buying an ethnography off Amazon. We also talking about doing ethnography when we do research. Participant observation is a basic research method of anthropology. It involves participating in the everyday life of the group you're studying it, and then observing it, and then participating again. So you cannot observe while you're participating. You cannot participate while you're observing. There's no way to know what you look like while you're dancing, unless you have a camera on you and a giant screen, but that is really weird. There's definitely, though, no way of knowing what it feels like to dance unless you actually jump in and do it. And so these are it's an iterative process. You go back and forth. You go back and forth between participating and observing. Ideal and real, emic versus edic. So we've already talked about emic and edic. Ideal versus real. There's ideal culture, what people think they should be doing. This is known as ought, what I ought to do. Actually, it's really important, and it's totally unknown without talking to the real people who are actually there directly. Emic knowledge. So if you want to know what this neighborhood thinks about getting married and having babies, should one come before the other? Which one, right? Should you get married first and then have babies, or should you have babies first and then get married? And so there's no way of knowing what the community thinks unless you ask them. You have to sort of walk through the community, walk down the street, and ask people from one house to the next, what do you think? Well, what do you think? What do you think? And they're going to give you cultural ideals. And I bet you here in Hamilton, they'll probably say you should get married first and then have babies. But then you can figure out the real. What are people actually doing? This is a very different question. We're not talking about ought. We're not talking about what should be the case. We're talking about what is actually the case. The edic goal of the anthropologist, remember edic, more technical goal here, since the people themselves might be unaware of how far they are missing the mark. You go to those same people and you say, well, I know you said you should get married and then have babies after that, but how many people actually live up to that value? And you ask them that, and you may find that they have opinions, right? They say, "Oh yeah, no, it's true. We really should be doing this. We should be getting married and then having babies." But actually, what people actually do is they have babies first, right? We violate our own values. This is very common. This is one of the richest sources for anthropological analysis. Is the contradiction between beliefs and practices, between what we say we should do and what we actually do. Um, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty, written by a person who was very wealthy off the labor of his unliberated slaves, human beings that he owned. So there's a contradiction right there in American history in 1789, 1783, sorry, when we are um, getting getting this nation together, and it works itself out 4 score and 7 years later with the Civil War. Finally works there, so somewhere around there, 80 to 90 years later, we see a war, them going to war over the contradiction between beliefs and practices.